I came across your work on the Disinformation website and your article, The Romans Meet Jesus, and I read your booklet on Scribe Faking Jesus, and you're also the author of Jesus the Sorcerer. Can you tell us about your background and what made you be interested in this topic and get that information out there?
Well, I was working way back in the day, in the 1970s, as a surgical assistant for a big, busy surgical group, and decided I was not going to go to medical school because I did not want to work that hard. So I basically went to the University of Western Kentucky and started taking ancient languages. Took Greek, took some classical Hebrew, a smattering of Aramaic and a little bit of Coptic. And then one of my professors basically told me that I was on the fast track to unemployment since the humanities, well, maybe you don't know, you may not be that old, but the humanities were beginning to really take a dive in the 1970s. And so I switched majors, got out of the humanities, but retained an interest in Christian origins. So I've kind of followed it on again, off again for quite a long time, and then got interested in magic, and particularly as it pertains to antiquity, and realized that a lot of the New Testament stories of exorcisms and what have you are duplicated in the ancient literature. To say nothing of dreams, magical dreams, such as in Matthew, just a number of pieces of information like that. So I began to study it a little more and do some research. I did Jesus the Sorcerer through an independent publisher in the UK. I think it was 2002, if I remember correctly. And then revised it, and then finally revised the book again and produced a book called Magic and Christianity from Jesus to the Gnostics, which the same publisher issued in 2014. So I also got interested in the secret gospel of Mark controversy. Not very many people outside of what I call Jesus studies are familiar with it. But I had written an essay and posted it on Scribd, a rather long essay, and then went to revise it and update it. And my editor said, you should turn this into a book, which I did, which came out about a year ago, I think at the very beginning of 2015. So I'm not, I didn't end up getting credentialed in this particular field, and I obviously don't therefore have a teaching position in it. But I have published independently, and then people like John Loftus, who runs Debunking Christianity, and the site that you encountered it on, have published the material after the editor took a look at it and liked it and thought it was pretty much up to snuff.
Throughout history and in modern academics, there's a debate about Jesus and his true commitment to either Greek culture, to Judaism, either Eastern religions or mystery cults or different things. So in your perspective, where would Jesus, the historical Jesus, lie within that spectrum?
Well, I think there is absolutely zero proof that Jesus had anything to do with Greek culture. And there is certainly no proof that Jesus had anything to do with Eastern religions or knew anything about them, would have been in any kind of position to know anything about them. There is a strand of thought within mainstream New Testament studies that argues that since Nazareth was 4 or 5 miles away from a Greco-Roman enclave called Sepphoris, that Jesus, must have known Greek and must have gone there to work as a carpenter, etc., etc. According to the evidence in the Gospels, because let me kind of interrupt that train of thought by saying that my interest primarily has always been in the text and what the text tells us about Jesus, rather than extrapolate from, where Sepphoris was. And okay, so Sepphoris was, relatively speaking, over the hill from Nazareth. And even though it was a very Jewish city, it was also a Greco-Roman enclave, and no doubt Latin was spoken there and Greek was spoken there. From that circumstance, a number of scholars have surmised that Jesus went to Sepphoris on a regular basis to practice his trade, and therefore must have known something about Greco-Roman culture. Well, having lived in cities that are much larger than Sepphoris, I can tell you that in Los Angeles, for example, we have an entire working underclass that gets up at 5 in the morning to trim hedges and mow lawns and has absolutely no contact whatsoever culturally with the English-speaking culture of Los Angeles. It is quite possible to be a menial worker and not have any meaningful mixture or exposure to the dominant culture. And even if Jesus, let us suppose, went to Sepphoris to go to work, there's no particular reason that Jesus would have assimilated to Greek culture, that he would have, say, gone to the theater and heard plays in Greek and what have you. So, first of all, there's that. The actual evidence of the Gospels speaks against that. The Gospel of John, for example, recounts Jesus going to Nazareth and the villagers of Nazareth saying, "Where does this man get this learning? His brothers and sisters are here among us, and he has no letters." The book of Acts, I believe it's chapter 4, says of Peter and John that they were in Greek agrammatos, in other words, literally without letters. So the implication there is that they had no schooling. You would expect a person who was a carpenter, the Greek term for that is tekton, which means basically a laborer who works with stone or wood. These individuals socially were beneath agricultural workers in the social hierarchy. So there would be no reason whatsoever that a fisherman or any of these individuals who followed Jesus would necessarily be literate. In fact, the estimate has been made that an educated guess is that less than 10% of the Roman population throughout the Roman Empire was literate, and it was possible to be an official in a city and not be able to read and write. So my belief is based on what the Gospels say about Jesus, particularly his association with John the Baptist, is that he basically got the messianic bug, so to speak, at about age 30, that he went to John and was baptized and began a career as an apocalyptic preacher, which is basically what John was. John was probably baptizing at the Jordan, because if you remember your Old Testament, that's where Elisha parted the water with his cloak. It was a site where individual prophets from the Old Testament, notable figures, had performed works of magic, basically, or works of power, miracles, whatever you want to call them. And it's been suggested, not by me, but by other people with more background than I, that John the Baptist may actually have chosen a spot on the Jordan that was associated in legend with these prophetic figures. So I see Jesus as being essentially an apocalyptic prophet who foretold the restoration of Israel, the overthrow of Roman rule, and that he foretold that the kingdom of God, in other words, the kingdom of Israel, would come within the lifetime of his disciples. And in fact, the Gospels have Jesus saying those very words. So I also believe that Jesus' career probably lasted less than a year. I think that Jesus went up to Jerusalem with the full expectation that the kingdom of God was coming. He went there at Passover, which was a dangerous time to be going to Jerusalem and preaching about kingdoms, because Passover obviously commemorates the deliverance of the Jews from the Egyptians. And there was a very strong military presence in Jerusalem at Passover because it was a celebration of national liberation. And the Romans had no intention whatsoever that the Jews were going to be liberating themselves from Roman rule. And not about, 30 or so years, 35 years after Jesus' death, a war finally did break out between the Jews and the Romans that culminated in the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So the Romans had reason to be concerned.
So where does the idea of magic fall in within this perspective?
The apocalyptic prophets, Josephus actually mentions several of them in his Wars of the Jews. How would you know that somebody was a prophet? I mean, how would they establish their bona fides? Well, basically, they did that through the performance of miracles, through powerful works. And this was not an uncommon situation in Roman Palestine, or for that matter, anywhere in the Roman Empire. We have an almost contemporary figure called Apollonius of Tyana, who has an entire career that is extensively reported by a later writer called Philostratus. And Apollonius was famous for a number of things: curing diseases, casting out devils, cleaning up religious observances, doing many of the things that Jesus is famous for. So these people were basically swarming all over the Roman Empire. The average person, I don't think today, has any serious understanding about how intensely superstitious, or we would call it superstitious, that the people of that era were. They believed in ghosts. They believed in demons. They believed that people could send curses to them. They believed in the evil eye. They believed in all of these things that we would classify as rank superstition. They totally, utterly believed it. And that went from the lowest peasantry all the way up to the highest echelons of society. It was actually against the law to foretell the future of a Roman emperor, because it would suggest that the person was going to die. It was actually a capital offense to predict the future of a Roman official or high official emperor. And people were executed for exactly that sort of thing. So these people, as a culture, took all of these things very seriously, and they considered it part of their religion. They didn't consider it as necessarily magic. They didn't believe that they believed God spoke to them in dreams, just like characters in the New Testament see visions and have dreams that are warning them about things that are going to happen. This was perfectly a legitimate idea at the time.
So tell us about your research on demonology in Greek Roman culture. I know that in Babylonian beliefs there was ways of transferring a demon from human into an animal, or at least using an animal to help release someone from a demon. What was the culture like regarding demonology at that time?
Well, we have the example of Jesus casting the demon out of the demoniac that is living among the tombs, and having the horde of demons go into a bunch of swine, and they run off the cliff into the sea and die. This is an extremely common attitude. It had probably been for millennia all over the Middle East. There were reports of people being cured of diseases by someone taking a puppy and basically rubbing the puppy up and down on them so that the dog, gets the disease and carries it away. There's actually a term in Greek for it, apopompe, which means to carry away a disease. It's the same idea in the Old Testament as the scapegoat, where the priest pronounces the sins of the people on the goat, and the goat for Azazel is led off into the wilderness, presumably to be eaten by Azazel or whatever happens later. But the idea that you could transfer demons from people into animals was obviously pretty common stuff. That's what people understood to happen. In Leviticus, there's a really weird spell. I forget which chapter it's in now, where people cleanse a house using birds, and they kill one of the birds, and then they let the other bird go. So this is a very common notion actually at the time.
So reading your article, The Romans Meet Jesus, there was things that came to mind. One of the ways that Christians support their claims is to say that Jesus and his followers brought a new anthropology into the world, like that because they were teaching that humans are made in the image of God and that we're all equal, that they were able to reach the masses and the slaves and the people who had no rights or power at that time. But in your article, you show how the Romans saw Christianity as a religion of women and slaves, and in a negative way, that both of those groups of people didn't have the knowledge or the understanding to be able to make rational decisions regarding, what's true and what's not. So how do you see that? Like, how do we as modern people relate to the inner conflicts back then, and how, you can look at it from the Christian perspective or from the Roman perspective, but where does the truth lie within those two ideas?
Well, I think the Romans were basically correct. And I mean, I would hope that modern people would not relate to those stories. I think it is a hideous mistake that we keep making to take holy books that were written 2,000 or more years ago and accept any of those norms as something that we would want to impose within our own lives, or least of all on society, on other people. But in terms of the women and slaves question, Greek women at the time were sequestered. There was a special part of the house where the women lived, and we think of that as typically in Islamic societies of the harem type of arrangement, but that was very much true of Greek society among educated higher level people, that they had a house in which the women were essentially cloistered. Women were not out as public figures in the Roman Empire unless they were out as shopkeepers or something of that nature, which had a sort of questionably, disreputable type of feel to it. And there was certainly no effort among Greco-Roman society to educate women or to encourage them to lead an independent life. It's like, even I think it's in 1 Timothy, where the writer, who is allegedly Paul said that women will be saved through childbirth. The function of women in Greco-Roman society was to make babies and to keep the house. And that was basically as far as it went. And it was a scandal among Romans that women had a predominant role in this Jesus cult. And it was a terrible scandal that the witnesses of the resurrection were women, and that they went to an empty tomb. In Mark, they go to this empty tomb. They see this young man that later writers assumed to be an angel, and Mark ends with them running in terror and saying nothing. And then by the time Matthew reworks the story, the women run joyfully and tell the apostles and so on. This was a terrible problem for Christianity, because resurrection, as far as pagans were concerned, was a ridiculous idea. And the notion that you would have the witnesses of the resurrection being women who were considered to be terribly unreliable witnesses. I don't even know if their testimony could be accepted in court at the time. That these were the witnesses of the resurrection was a scandal to Romans. And the later Gospels, Luke and John, begin to fix this problem by having male witnesses to the resurrection, because that's really the only way in which you could verify it in the minds of your typical Greco-Roman audience. So if you're looking at when you look at the spread of Christianity, I think there is no debate at all among mainstream New Testament scholars that Christianity spread among an illiterate, basically illiterate lower class of people, and that it was whispered in the houses that the Roman philosopher Celsus accuses the Christians of basically sneaking Christianity into households and preying on gullible, uneducated youth, people who did not have the experience or education to be critical or skeptical of anything. It was kind of like Campus Crusade for Christ, or all the rest of these churches that gather around the edge of the typical college campus. They know that, these are young people. They're beginning to explore the world, so let's take advantage of that, and let's talk to people who don't have the experience and education yet to question, for the most part, what we're saying. And that's still the attraction among Christians proselytizing today. That's, I think, quite typical of what was going on there. And the Romans were suspicious of it because the Christians also met at night. And meeting at night was considered borderline seditious. It was considered highly suspicious, questionable. Nighttime was when people got together to, perform the Dionysic rituals, which the Romans called orgy, which basically means a gathering, a sacred gathering, without the overtone necessarily of sex, but certainly it had that also. So, the Christian claims that they made, if you look at the letters of Ignatius in the early 2nd century, he calls the Eucharist the flesh of God. He talks about the blood of God. And the Romans must have gone, huh? Yeah, these people, Jesus was a condemned criminal. He was condemned and executed for sedition. And these people are getting together in the evening, and they claim to be eating his blood and flesh. I mean, the typical Roman would be scandalized by that. They would think that was just the most bizarre thing imaginable.
If the portrayal of Christians is of uneducated people, and then in another passage you mentioned how a lot of the conflict was because of them performing vandalism or doing things that in the Roman culture it was frowned upon, either because of their lack of sexual involvement or because of their sexual aberrations. Are the Romans a good, reliable source to focus our attention on? Because if they were the conquerors and they were the people who were oppressing either the Jewish or Gentile followers of Jesus, why take them at their word when they're portraying them in a negative light, since they had a lot of conflict with all the groups that they were oppressing at that time?
Well, the Romans weren't, first of all, they weren't oppressing everybody. I mean, the Romans understood that you had to pick your fights. The Romans had outposts all over the empire, and they didn't go around, for the most part, trying to grind people under their heel. The Romans had a perfectly workable relationship with the upper echelon of Jewish society. Herod built the Second Temple, which was an enormous complex that cost a huge fortune to put together. And Herod was basically a Roman client king. And he had, like I said, a perfectly good or reasonably good working relationship with the authorities, the Jewish authorities who had Jesus arrested and turned over to the Romans. The Jews in charge of the temple were acutely aware of the problem of messianism, of apocalyptic ideas, of independence movements, bringing everything crashing down on their heads. And so they had an arrangement which was mutually beneficial to them and to the Romans to keep things running, to keep the gears oiled. And I think that that's probably was true in most of the Roman provinces. We get the notion from movies, I think, mostly that the Romans were these, mad conquerors who were just out pillaging and burning. But that's not obviously the way that you hold an empire together, unless maybe you're George Bush. But the point being that the Romans also accommodated religions. They accommodated religions that came from Egypt. They accommodated Serapis. They accommodated Isis. They accommodated, eventually, Dionysus. They accommodated any number of foreign deities, because there was nothing within paganism that stipulated that you could only have one god. You could have as many deities as you wanted. You could spend as much time and money as you wanted worshiping whoever. The Romans didn't care, as long as it wasn't seditious, as long as it was not a focus of illegal activity and didn't stir up a lot of crap for the Roman Empire, because all they were basically interested in at the end of the day was keeping the peace. So when Pliny, who is a governor in Asia Minor, writes the emperor, he said, we've got these Christians and the people don't like them. So it was mostly the popular people who didn't like Christians for various reasons. And, he writes, the emperor says, what am I supposed to do with them? And the attitude of the Roman Empire was, if they cause trouble, deal with them, but don't go hunting them down. Now, after about the early 4th century, well, actually about the early 5th century, let us say after about 375 to the year 400, somewhere along in there, the Roman Empire becomes Christianized to the extent that Roman officials become bishops, sometimes even without being baptized first. They move basically from civil service directly into the church, back and forth, so that the church essentially becomes the state, or coterminous with the state. And at that point, especially under emperors, later emperors like Theodosian, the Christians take the gloves off, and they begin to to vandalize Jewish synagogues. They drive the Jewish community out of Alexandria. They burn the Serapeum with its library because it happened to be a temple to Serapis. They didn't care that there were books in there. They didn't care that it was this huge library and that they were destroying all of these things. And then under Coptic authorities like Shinut, they basically begin to organize what are essentially death squads of monks, and they begin to invade temples and people's homes. They begin to destroy their shrines. They go to the Egyptian temples and they begin to methodically chisel the features off of the faces of the gods, and they begin to basically vandalize everything that they can find. So at that point, then the pagans, it's too late for them to do anything, but the last pagan voices that we hear from that era are absolutely horrified and disgusted, because the Christians become then what ISIS is today, going around destroying monuments and defacing what we regard as archaeological treasures. But that was Christianity in the late 4th and the 5th century. It becomes this totalitarian religion, and it was, of course, always totalitarian in the sense that you could only have one God. If you look at John, where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except for me." That's a totalitarian claim. That is a claim that no Roman would have made about a God. Or if you look at Acts, early in Acts, where it says, "There's no other name given under heaven by which we must be saved." That's a totalitarian claim. It's our way or the highway. Now, at that point, Christianity could not enforce that. But once they became the state religion, they ushered in essentially 15 centuries of unrelenting violence against unbelievers and people that they had differences of opinion with, which we all know that history, I would think.
But do you believe that these ideas were because of their group couldn't fulfill its desire to have the Messiah return and establish the kingdom, or does it come from archaic biblical concepts of God reigning over the world, or is it just a very insidious group that wanted to force everybody to accept their views?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. You know, that Jesus is clearly expecting the end of Roman rule in his lifetime. He foretells this figure, the Son of Man, which is probably a reflection of a prophecy in Daniel, where Daniel says, "I saw the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven," and so on and so on. There was a lot of apocalypticism and nationalism within Judea and Galilee, which was understandable because these were poor people. They were being taxed. The sons followed the trade of their fathers. Joseph was a carpenter. Jesus is a carpenter. These people were locked into a society with essentially zero mobility on average. I mean, you were born and died in your village doing what you were going to do. These were immiserated people who believed that they were God's people, that they had a kingdom that had been taken away from them by Gentiles. They read this in their scriptures. They were the chosen people. I mean, if you look, you say, we're the chosen people, and here we are paying taxes to pagans. How does that work? Sure, yeah. I think there's a well of anger, some of it very justified in terms of the Romans dealing with troublemakers. It was swift justice. I mean, the Roman authorities said, kill him, and it's done. I mean, there's not a bunch of appeal processes and waiting in prison for your lawyer to come. This is kind of like over and done with. So, yeah, I think that there's plenty of reason for these people to have been angry. And once these messianic hopes were dashed, then, I mean, you have the people who believe that they have the Word of God. They look at the Word of God and it says X. And they're looking around in the world and saying, why is there, no X happening here? It's kind of the same situation when we have fundamentalists who are out proclaiming God's judgment on everybody on a weekly basis. And, the end of the world is almost here. I don't know if you've seen that book, The Late Great Planet Earth. It came out in the 1970s, and Hal Lindsey foretold this planet's going to burn up. Of course, it doesn't, and it hasn't, and based on the Bible, it never will, but you have people clinging to that, and there's got to be a lot of frustration, and then you have people who have decided, it's like the vulture saying, I'm not waiting anymore, I'm going to kill something. So there's a combination of all of that. I've told people, look at Genesis 1:28, where God says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have everything in dominion. Now, what could possibly go wrong? It's basically, in that one verse, the God of the Old Testament basically hands humanity the recipe for their own extinction. It's like, we'll just fill this planet up to the brim, and we will pretend that we're the overlords, and we're going to take everything and use it for ourselves because God gave us this planet. God gave the Jews the Old Testament. I mean, the promised land in the Old Testament, and we're still having people blowing up buses and killing one another over Palestine, which is basically a bunch of acres of gravel. Once people dig in and they entrench and they understand these promises as applying to them, and this is an entitlement that came right down from heaven, watch out, because they take it very seriously. And I'm sure that the Jews in the first century took it very seriously. In fact, we know they did. They had 3 wars with the Romans before the Romans finally destroyed the city and basically just kicked all the Jewish population out and said, don't come back. And I mean, that was the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century. And he built an entirely new city there for a while until finally the Jewish population came back. But basically, on a whole, the Romans were accommodating with people. They didn't go in and try to remove their religion.
So let's get back to magic in the Bible. I know that there's prohibitions against the occult and magical practices in Leviticus, and it's interesting that if they are done in the name of God, they're okay, but if they're done in the name of different deities or demons, they're bad. But there's a distinction between the ones that are done for good and the ones that are done for evil or to manipulate the elements. At the time of Jesus, had all that been kind of muddled, and it wasn't as crisp of a separation between what was considered kosher and what wasn't? Because when you read the Talmud and other Jewish folkloric books, it talks about rabbis had similar powers and they had the ability to create new life and do things. They were always pointing to the glory of God, but there was that thin line. And then in the later understanding of magic, there was back and forth between Jewish sources and then being able to collaborate or work with European culture in relation to magic or metallurgy or other types of ways of manipulating the elements. How was it at that time? Was it frowned upon? I know you mentioned in one of your articles how that was the accusation against Jesus, that he was using magic to perform miracles. So what's your view on that topic?
Well, I think my magic is your miracle, or your miracle rather is magic, and my miracle is magic to you. We have basically the same types of people doing the same types of things. They're casting out devils, they're prophesying, foretelling the future, they're interpreting dreams, they're making love potions, they're making potions to get you luck at the races, they'll help you, with your real estate deal. The whole thing is people going to the palm reader, essentially, or going to the card reader to get advice about what's happening. This culture at this time is completely permeated with this sort of thing from wall to wall, ceiling to floor. So there's really no way to clearly divide it. And in fact, if you look at the literature on New Testament studies, you can read probably 100 different opinions where people have spent thousands of pages and burned down a forest looking at this question, and someone else will come along and say, yes, but, and point out the fallacy, the problem with this distinction between miracle and magic, or religion and magic. And essentially, at the end of the day, I think you have to conclude that there just is not any distinction. It's just all in the eye of the beholder. But that's an apologetic stance. Because you see, the Romans certainly distinguished between religion and magic to some extent, in that magic was malicious, individual against individual. But then look at the letter to the Galatians, where Paul says, you're listening to another gospel, and if anybody teaches you a gospel other than the gospel that I preached, he says, a curse on him. And the curse that he's using is basically, the form that he's using basically is understood to apply to the evil eye. So in other words, Paul is looking at these other preachers and he's going, I see you, which was not a good thing at the time, because the baskanos in Greek, the evil eye, is taken seriously. It means that you're cursing someone to death, and you can give them the eye and cause them to die or to have mishap befall them. So it's very hard for an apologist to wade into this without drowning, because there's just too much stuff in the New Testament that you can find essentially word for word in the Greek magical papyri or in other sources that have survived. Take Lucian's story, the lover of lies, and it's just like one story after another being told at this supper, where individuals are recounting material that could almost have been lifted directly from the New Testament, and some people have actually suggested that Lucian had read at least one of the Gospels and was actually poking fun at Christianity.
So are you saying that Jesus and his followers were involved in the occult? Because according to Jewish sources, the power to manipulate the elements either came from demons or it came from the angels that taught it to the women and the Nephilim. But there was always this conflict between like Moses and the magicians of Pharaoh, and it was always related to who can manipulate the elements and who had God on his side. So when it all comes down to it, I've heard people say that Jesus was a Kabbalist and that he had hidden knowledge to be able to do certain things, but he did it outside of the realm of the authority of God. What is the main point of him being a sorcerer?
Well, going back to the text, if you remember in the book of John, the Gospel of John, the scribes come down from Jerusalem. They didn't come down there sightseeing. They come down there to check out Jesus. They came out to check out John the Baptist. And they said, he has Beelzebub. He controls demons by the ruler of the demons. So basically they're saying that Jesus is an arch magician who can cast out devils with the prince of the devils. And it's interesting that the church historian Eusebius wrote a tract about Apollonius of Tyana casting out demons and said, well, he could only cast them out because he had control over demons. So this is an old accusation that's leveled at Jesus. It was leveled by Christians at other exorcists. In Mark, which is the first gospel, which is written probably no longer than, say, 30 years after Jesus' death, the disciples are pointing out that there's some stranger going around using Jesus' name to cast out devils. In the book of Acts, the 7 Jewish sons of Sceva try to cast out devils using Jesus' name, and for a comic effect or to ridicule them, the demon-possessed man turns on them and casts them out of the house, and it says they flee naked and bleeding. So, yes, Jesus was accused of using the occult in the Gospels by representatives of the Jewish leadership. I mean, right within his own lifetime. The philosopher Celsus accused Jesus of being a sorcerer hated by God. And when Origen gets around to writing Contra Celsum back about like 70 years later, he spends a huge amount of energy and page after page after page trying to refute the charge that Jesus and his followers are practicing magic by their cures. And in the process, he gives you this lurid, very long description of how people in the 2nd century thought magic worked. But if you think about it, I mean, the commonality is, regardless of whether you regard it as white magic or black magic, it has a common denominator, and that is that these people are convinced that the world is operated by spirits. Some of the spirits are good, some of the spirits are bad, but one way or another, you're controlling things by controlling spirits. So, I mean, when we look at it, if you look at it from having that common denominator, then that's why it's so hard to parse it and to tease it apart and see, to make a decision about, what's black and what's white magic. Well, it depends on whose ox is being gored.
Let's talk about Gnosticism. According to Gershon Scholem, who was one of the scholars who reintroduced mysticism into intellectual studies of Judaism, he felt that there was not such a thing as Jewish Gnosticism, especially as Kabbalist literature did not start until in the later centuries. So when people talk about Gnosticism being alive in the time of Jesus or in the 1st century, he says that maybe it's kind of taking ideas from the Greco-Roman world and interpreting apocalyptic terms or spirituality from the 1st century. What is your stance on the Gnostic connections between the New Testament and what you've been able to find with your research?
Well, I think if you read current literature, I mean, I've read Gershom Scholem, very bright, extremely bright guy, and I think, though, if you read current literature, if you read material that's been published in, say, the last 10 years, I think you will find that there is a tendency among the specialists now to really question the whole category of Gnosticism. The term Gnosticism comes into the Christian vocabulary primarily from Irenaeus, and he's using the Greek term Gnostikos almost, I'm tempted to say, as a know-it-all rather than a quote-unquote Gnostic. None of the Gnostics, the so-called Gnostics, do not call themselves Gnostics. So they don't self-identify as such. And if you get into the thickets of what Gnosticism taught, it's this unbelievable jungle of ideas. It was practically, as one writer said, everything that they found, they devoured it and regurgitated it in some form. And Irenaeus basically said the same thing about the various Christian sects of his day that he labeled Gnostic. He said, they're writing some new book, some foolishness that's new every single day. They come up with some crazy thing that nobody's thought of before, and I'd say that's actually not a far-fetched description of Gnosticism. But a couple of things about that. First of all, in John, Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." That's a very Gnostic thing to say. It's not about faith, it's about knowledge. You will know the truth. I mean, I don't think any Gnostic would say, that's wrong, because that's basically what Gnosticism was about knowledge. It was about inner knowledge, or it was about divinely revealed knowledge, or it was about magically revealed knowledge. And the other thing about it is that all of the early apologists' criticisms of the Carpocratians and all the rest of the different Gnostic groups always accuse them of magical practice, and always specify the different kinds of magic they were supposedly doing. So I think that there was a tendency among magicians, if you read the magical papyri, for example, they are conspicuous by their consumption of ideas. Everything that comes along, it can be Jewish, it can be Greek, it can be Egyptian, it's all dumped into the same pot. It's like the Mediterranean world is this big melting pot of hoo-ha, where every single thing that comes along, every divine name, every formula that somebody thinks up is grabbed up willy-nilly and thrown in on the theory that, hey, maybe it'll work. And instead of listing one name to conjure with, they just start stringing out names. I command you in the name of this, and this other god to do, whatever, bring this woman to me or something. So in terms of Gnosticism, first of all, I don't really think there was a Gnosticism as we conceive of it. Our concept of Gnosticism is basically, besides the church fathers and their denunciations and the few paragraphs that they devote to Gnostics, we have the Nag Hammadi codices. This is not a very large collection. This was probably the personal reading material of maybe one individual or one small monastery that was hidden out in the desert when Athanasius decided that there was going to be a certain number of books in the New Testament and everything else had to go. I can see that some anxious monks said, oh God, they're going to come and they're going to sequester our books and they're going to burn them. So they go off into the desert and they hide them. And then we fortunately accidentally discover them, and some of that material survives long enough to get into the hands of experts. But that's a very small sample. That's like trying to go into, say, my house and look at what I'm reading and then making a call and extrapolating from what I'm reading to like some larger culture. And that's a pretty kind of ludicrous thing to do if you think about it. It's the same way with our Gospels. We have 4 canonical Gospels. We have the Gospel of Judas that was discovered and then nearly destroyed by the people who, were trying to sell it. And we have the few fragmentary Gospels, and then we have some quotations of others. So we suspect probably there were as many as 30 Gospels that are mentioned or named somewhere, circulating around in, say, about the 2nd century. And of these 30, we have 4, essentially, in more or less whole condition, assuming that they were copied correctly and so on and so on and so on. But we're looking at, I think the thing that a lot of people lose sight of, even specialists lose sight of, is that we are overall, for the whole ancient world, regardless of what field it is, we are looking at a very, very tiny sample of what was once there. And then we're making very broad assumptions based on it.
In one of your works, you quote Elaine Pagels, an expert in the Gnostic Gospels. Can you tell us about where Gnosticism is found in Paul's writings?
Well, it depends on what you call Paul's writings, because I think the consensus of opinion that Colossians, which to me is the most Gnostic book, is not by Paul. So it's not an authentic book written by Paul. Let's call it the School of Paul. And in Colossians, for example, we have all the richness or the fullness dwells in him. The term is pleroma, which in Gnostic thought was kind of like the whole potentiality of the universe, which is not a Palestinian Jewish peasant idea. This is something that probably would come from a place like the Jewish community, say, of Alexandria, something on that order. But this does not at all sound like the Jesus of the Gospels. This doesn't resonate at all with what Jesus said. Once Jesus promised kingdom doesn't come, and it doesn't come, and it still doesn't show up, then Christianity has to do something. It either has to say, okay, we give up, we're wrong, which never happens with a religion, or they have to develop a theology. And so they go fishing. And so in Paul's letters, his genuine letters, you're constantly running across the mystery this and the mystery of that and the mystery of something else. And I'm going like, where's all this mystery coming from? Except that Paul is walking through all of these Greco-Roman cities, and what's he encountering? Mystery cults everywhere. Everybody that talks religion is talking about, the mystery will be revealed and, blah, 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 blah. And so, of course, Paul's, okay, that works. And suddenly everything's a mystery. The kingdom of God is a mystery, and the gospel is a mystery, and the union with Jesus is a mystery, and the recalcitrance of the Jewish population is a mystery, and everything's a mystery. So you see this bleeding into the Bible's books, but without any real deep understanding, because I don't think Paul went to a mystery cult. I don't think he studied the mysteries. I don't think he went to the oracle of Apollo and checked it all out, because he's a Pharisaic Jew. But he's capturing the vocabulary. It becomes a catchword. It becomes like the new cool thing to say to get people's attention. And I think Paul is always doing that. I think that to put it rather bluntly, Paul is basically a religious grifter. He picks up bits and pieces and he cobbles them together. And essentially, in Acts talks him about appearing before these philosophers on the Areopagus. They basically say the same thing. They call him in Greek, they call him a spermologus. They call him it's like a bird going around picking up seeds. The bird doesn't know what the seeds are of. It doesn't investigate where they come from. It just picks them up. And I think Paul is doing very much the same thing, that he's just sort of gathering things willy-nilly. And then as you read his letters, starting with the earliest one, which is almost certainly First Thessalonians, and then you're following his idea about the parousia, or the return of Christ, you see it evolving and changing, and depending on whatever circumstances he finds himself in. Which, again, let me mention that the letters of Paul are occasional letters written to individuals and to churches. They're not some kind of theological, volume that Paul sat down to write, to order all of his thoughts and to explain in methodical detail what his quote-unquote theology was. So again, we're confronted with this problem of having a sample of what Paul wrote, which is probably contaminated with interpolations and with some editing. And we're trying to construct from that a systematic theology which was never there, in the same way that we look at the Gnostic writings, which we have labeled Gnostic, and then we look at them and then we try to construct something from them that was actually never there. And I believe a lot of scholars are coming to that understanding of Gnosticism, that it's something that, following the lead of a couple of early Christian apologists, we have kind of seen something that was always a mirage.
Can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of the sexuality of Jesus and of his followers?
I don't think we have any understanding of it. I think that in Luke, there's a very disturbing little passage in Luke where Jesus said that if a man does not hate his mother, his father, his wife, his children, and his sisters and brothers, he cannot be my follower. That's pretty harsh. I mean, it's just like, here it is, take it or leave it. You hate everybody in your family, or hit the road, Jack. Now, according to the Gospels, Jesus was about 30 years old when he came to John to be baptized. Now, we never hear anything about wife or children. Speculation aside, there's no evidence in the Gospels that I can have ever seen that suggests that Jesus was married or had children. But let's think about it. Okay, Jesus is a Jew. He's observant. He's 30 years old. What's he supposed to be doing? He's supposed to be getting married and having children. So if he comes to John the Baptist and gets baptized, and he starts this career of preaching that gets him executed by the Romans, is it possible that he had a wife and he had children, and he suddenly, heard the call and took off and left them? Maybe he was telling his disciples, I'm leading by example. In the Gospel of John, he's preaching, and his family comes, and they say he's out of his mind. And Jesus says, hey, my family are the believers. My family are the people who hear God's message. Now that sounds like a kook to me. That sounds like a person who has joined a cult. Somebody who basically needs to be deprogrammed, as we would call it. There must have been hundreds of these people running around Palestine. I mean, we don't have treatment for the mentally ill. We don't have people that, we don't have counselors or psychologists telling you the voices in your head aren't real. Take this pill and maybe they'll go away. There's really no telling where this motivation for in Jesus' particular case or anyone else's particular case actually comes from. Maybe if we got in a time machine and we went back and we actually met Jesus, we would go, sheesh, really? A world religion is based on this? And we would come back and we would, have learned a lesson. But No, I don't think we know anything at all about Jesus' sexuality. I think this whole thing about, Mary Magdalene and, he got married and they had children and the children became rulers in France or something is like that's absolutely laughable. And the idea that Jesus might have been a homosexual, he might have been gay. Well, I don't know. I mean, 3% of the population is, and probably 3% of the population always has been. Maybe Jesus wasn't married because he didn't feel, the urge to get married. I mean, that's a possibility, but there's no conceivable way to know that based on the textual evidence that we have.
But in Faking Jesus booklet on Scribed, you mentioned that there was a polemic with the early Christians regarding their sexual orientation or practices. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I think that there was no such thing at the time as a recognized sexual orientation. I think that people in the Greco-Roman world did not divide sexual orientation along the axis of heterosexual, homosexual. I think that they divided it along the axis of what we would colloquially call pitchers and catchers. If you were an aggressive male, then within Greco-Roman culture, you were allowed sex with other men if they were submissive men or if they were younger men. And obviously, you were allowed sex with women because they were submissive by definition. So I think I think that it's a mistake to superimpose categories that we have today on people that were living 2,000 years ago, particularly based on scant evidence. Jesus, however, has some kind of crazy things to say. In Matthew 19, he talks about there were eunuchs who were born eunuchs and eunuchs made by men, and then there were eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. If you read translations of that, you will have all kinds of interpretations, but the verb means made themselves eunuchs. It doesn't mean that they lived as celibate or something other than that, because Jesus certainly knew the difference between a guy with no nads and a guy with no wife. He may have been a peasant, but hey, nobody is that ignorant. So when Jesus is calling on people to basically castrate themselves as eunuchs were castrated by their owners, he's either calling for an extreme gesture of renunciation or he's using it literally. Now, it's hard to imagine that he's using it literally because, as you are probably very well aware, eunuchs and men who had been similarly mutilated were not allowed to participate in Jewish ritual. So this is not the kind of thing that Jesus, as an observant Jew, would have been preaching. What he meant by that is open to interpretation. The church father Origen took him literally. Sometime in his teens, he castrated himself. Self-castration was actually a ritual of the mother goddess in Asia Minor. Men obviously, got into an ecstatic trance and picked up a ritual knife, cut off those testicles, and ran through the streets holding them in their hands like, hey, look what I did. So based on what very little we know about that, it's hard to say. Now, we know about Greco-Roman culture because not only do we have written evidence, we have an enormous collection of vase paintings that show same-sex behavior. I tend not to even use the term homosexual in that context because homosexual was coined in 1870 or something. And we have people who are essentialists versus, people who believe that it was socially constructed, and if you use that term about anybody, they get all upset. So I just basically say, okay, let's just jump over that fence and completely leave that alone, and let's just call it same-sex behavior. It appears clear, however, that later on in Christianity, from Epiphanius and also Celsus, that certain Christian groups apparently privileged homosexuality or same-sex behavior, or at least that was the accusation. And I think that those accusations bear some consideration, because the writers actually kind of offer the theological justification behind it. So if they were just making it up out of thin air, it does not seem likely that they would have an explanation for it. They would just, but let's be clear that doesn't have to go back to Jesus. Christianity doesn't go back to Jesus. Christianity goes back to Paul. As far as Jesus was concerned, if Jesus came back literally and looked at it's like St. Patrick's Cathedral, I think he would be like, what the hell is this thing? I think Jesus was an observant Jew. I don't think that he had any intention of founding a religion that ended up persecuting Jews and getting people thrown out of synagogues. I think that's a basically ridiculous idea. So looking at Jesus' sexuality, I would say we're looking into a dark room looking for a black cat.
I want to thank you very much for this interview, and we like to build a relationship with our guests. I know you're very busy, and you mentioned in one of our emails that you usually don't do this. Would you be interested in coming on the show to talk about the other topics that you discuss in your books? Because I really find what you're saying revolutionary, in the sense of a lot of it has been hidden over, or in the academic world, they bury it under a lot of stuff. So by the time you get to it, you have to be doing a PhD or something to get there.
Yeah, it is. I admit it is hard. It is hard. But, if you're an academic and you're teaching in a program that is basically, say, a Bible college or even a state school, and you are wanting tenure and you're wanting publishers to publish your material, you have to be judicious, let us say, selective about what you're going to say and what kind of claims that you're going to make. And I am hopefully fully aware of what the canons of evidence are. And I hope that I very strictly adhere to what is probable and to what is knowable, and then when we're off into the thickets of something that cannot be known, that we label it as conjecture, and then hopefully just don't go there, because what's the point? Well, you could make up anything. Jesus could be an alien, whatever, Jesus could be Horus, who knows? People have come up with this and other ideas. Like I said, I'm textually centered. I believe that the text, as imperfect as it is probably the best that we're going to get.
What would you say to critics that would see your research as part of an anti-supernatural perspective? For Christians or people from any faith, a quick way to undermine any scientific or critical view of their perspective is to say, well, they're just anti-supernatural. If they believed in the supernatural, then they would be open to all these narratives. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think that my approach to the text is to look at it as a text that is influenced by other text. And if you, as the article points out without getting into huge detail about it, there are plenty of other texts that are similar or relate to this in that they set up a genre, a ghost story type of narrative that is pervasive throughout the culture. And I don't think it's accidental that you find these same elements in the Gospels of John and Luke in particular. And in terms of undermining supernaturalism, I don't think that I or other people are necessarily out on a crusade to demolish supernaturalism per se, but supernaturalism is kind of a misnomer, because if there really is such a thing as, say, life after death, then it's not supernatural, it's natural. If there's such a thing as telepathy, then it's not supernatural or paranormal, it's normal, because it's a part of the universe that we confront and we could potentially study. So by calling something that is out of the ordinary paranormal or supernatural, it's kind of bracketing that off as being, say, special in some way, in which it may not be that special. It may just be something that is rare or something that occurs unusually or under only a particular set of circumstances. So having said that, and going back to the specific points about the supernatural, quote-unquote, elements of the Gospels, I would say that to illustrate this, for example, and how this would work, let us say that you were in a creative writing class. I think you would discover that most of it wouldn't be very creative and some of it wouldn't qualify as writing, but let's call it creative writing. And someone said, I want you to write a vampire story. I mean, you would already know all the parameters of a vampire story, right? You would know that, they don't have a reflection in a mirror, they come out at night, they can't be exposed to sunlight, etc., etc. Even without being a big fan of vampire stories, you would understand what was expected. Basically, you would understand the limits, the framework of a vampire story. That's what makes it a genre. It doesn't mean that it can't be played with around the edges, that it can't even be undermined, that it can't be turned in a humorous direction or something of that nature, but it still has to conform to certain narrative standards that have evolved in society. I was overhearing a program that somebody was watching a true crime, and it said that the victim is found face down in a pool of blood, for example. Why aren't they ever found face up? Doesn't it seem like at least like a 50-50 chance that if a person falls down, they would fall down face up? But think about the crime programs that you've seen where the detective comes in and they find the victim, and how is the victim usually laying? They're usually laying face down, right? In a pool of blood. It's become like this standard thing, this standard piece of narrative that is just out there. There's another one that really almost irritates me whenever somebody on the news reports a shooting. What do they say? Shots rang out. Really? Rang out how? Like a phone rings? How about a bell? Do they ring out like a bell? Shots don't ring out. Anybody who has heard gunfire doesn't describe it as ringing out. We don't say firecrackers ring out, do we? It's just one of these narrative elements that has evolved within our culture, and people simply repeat it. They just pick it up without thinking about it. And I think the same thing very much happens in the Gospels of Luke and John with the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. It's not that they're sitting down with ghost stories and selecting little bits and pieces like copying and pasting. They're simply tuning into a broad, universal cultural experience of what a post-mortem narrative looks like. So we come up with all the different elements that way that are listed in the Gospels, and that you can go back and forth between Gospels and between ghost stories, and you can say, yes, this matches, this matches, this matches, and all this kind of comes together. But it doesn't mean that they were plagiarizing it specifically, like some undergraduate student who is desperate to complete his paper. Does that kind of answer the question? Or?
So if it is them using common language or common metaphor to convey a religious concepts, where, when you're dealing with fundamentalists or evangelicals, do you see people struggling with this?
They simply take it as a matter of faith, which means it doesn't have to be proven. It doesn't have to be spelled out. There doesn't have to be evidence. It doesn't have to be duplicated. So the historical attitude is basically, it's a probabilistic attitude. It's like, what's more likely, that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared in a room where the doors were locked and had somebody stick their finger in his side? Or is it more probable that these elements came from a broader cultural understanding of what dead people do when they show up? And that raises another question about cultures, because in writing about magic in early Christianity and working through, for example, the Greek magical papyri, I have to stop and remind myself from time to time just how weird this view of the world is. The people of Jesus' day, pagans, probably as well as many Christians, had believed that the underworld was literally under your feet, that there were caverns, there were caves, grottos, there were certain lakes where probably methane or something else was occasionally escaping and killing wildlife. Birds would fly over it, drop into the water dead. And the ancients observed these things and thought that these were literal gates into the underworld. When a magician would conjure up the gods of the underworld, he meant literally the gods that are under our world. It's like you were walking around in a world that had a sub-basement and a basement below that, and below that, circles of hell, if you wish. That's a very strange thing to believe from a modern standpoint, although at the time, obviously, it made sense to a lot of people. If you look at Paul in Corinthians writing about, I know a man who went up to the third heaven, it reflects a standard view of the world, that the 7 planets were in different levels, representing different levels of heaven, and that you could go up and you could come down. You could go down to the underworld and you could tour around, and then you could come back up. That's a strange view of the world, that's not a view of the world that probably any sane individual has today. We understand that it's 93 million miles from here to the sun. The sky is not, the stars at night are not up in something called the Empyrean, where they're just kind of, the light is kind of coming through little holes in a canopy or something. The idea that you could walk down into hell or into Hades through a cave would qualify you as basically insane today. No one, I don't believe, actually accepts that. No one actually walking around holding a job probably believes any of that. But that was actually what people believed. They believed that you could go to a graveyard, dig a hole in the ground, stick a message in the dirt, covered up, and dead people would read it. So I think that we do a lot of reading of these texts through a filter in which we take the meaning of these texts, and we take what they say, and we kind of filter out the craziness of it. We bring it into our time. We're almost like each one of us is an editor who is adapting this text to his own worldview without realizing that the author of that text did not have that worldview. The author of this text didn't know that the earth is 3 point whatever billion years old it is. He didn't realize that there was a speed of light. He didn't realize that there were these planets were millions of miles away, not just up in the sky. So a modern person reading these texts has to stop and remind himself, I think, of how strange these texts actually are, including the texts in the Bible, that the things that these people assume, that they take for granted, are nothing like what the average person today assumes about the world. So from that standpoint, I would say that, it's kind of almost hard to truly relate to anything in the Bible because you can't really walk yourself back into that mindset. You can't forget all of the things that you know about the world and pretend you don't know them so as to truly get back into that. And that's kind of the fraudulent view when you see churches talking about, we preach New Testament Christianity. And I think, like hell you do. You don't believe what people believed 2,000 years ago. You don't believe that demons cause measles. Come on. You can't sit there and with a straight face tell anybody that you believe what the apostles believed. Really? Are you sure? I mean, have you forgotten all of the science, the basic stuff, the biology, everything else that you learned in grade school? Has all that been miraculously lifted right out of your head? Because no, you don't believe that. You don't have that same view of the world. You don't even start from anywhere close to the same place as these people did. But when you read those texts, you read them into your experience, not into their experience, I guess is what I'm saying.
During our last conversation, we talked about the Apostle Paul borrowing ideas from other groups. Is your position that the mystery religions influence the writing of the New Testament? Because some apologetic Christian groups, they would say that the similarities that you can see is that the mystery religions borrow stuff from the New Testament instead of the other way around because of the dating of some of those sources. How do you feel about that perspective?
I'm not an expert on mystery religions. I think that first of all, that you have to take this scant amount of writing that we have that survives that directly addresses the mystery religions. And it's very scant for a reason. They were mysteries, and they were supposed to be secretive. It was actually against the law to reveal the mysteries of, say, Eleusis. And that went on for like 2,000 years, and we do not have a clear explanation of it. The only real explanation or mention of it that we have that mentions specifics, as far as I know, comes out of early church fathers who were revealing these secrets in order to make fun of them and refute them. So the idea that the mystery religions borrowed from Christianity, I think, is easily disprovable. I think that's patently false. But again, it's not like Paul or someone else had to go around plagiarizing, lifting texts verbatim or ideas verbatim from the mystery religions. The whole idea of mysteries being revealed was obviously pretty common in the first century. And Paul is always sexing things up, as it were, by describing them as mysteries. The union of Christ and the church is a mystery, and the recalcitrance and stubbornness of the Jews is a mystery, and the mystery of the man of lawlessness, and this mystery and that mystery. So it was considered, obviously, attractive from a standpoint of recruiting people to toss that term mystery in there, that secrets will be revealed. It's kind of like, somebody opening a safe after 100 years to see what's in it. And that kind of thing is pretty much, I think, standard religious talk in the first century. So no, I don't think that there was necessarily a deliberate plagiarizing of it. It's just that the terminology is so common that it floats into everything.
Let's go to the topic of our show today. Tell us about the different types of ghost stories in the Roman world, and has someone categorized them? I know that you talked about different types of ghosts, but what are we looking for, and what can we find that is similar to what is discussed in the New Testament?
Well, if somebody wanted a perfect book description of ghost stories, there's a scholar named Debbie Felton who published a study of Greco-Roman ghost stories through University of Texas Press back, 10 years or more ago. And that's a remarkably good study of the basic narrative of the Greco-Roman ghost story. In terms of matching those up with the gospel accounts, the idea that ghosts would come back, for instance, and show the wounds that had killed them, such as Jesus coming back in the Gospel of John in particular and telling them to see, touch me, look, see these wounds. This was not uncommon in ghost stories. This was a feature of ghost stories at the time. The idea of sudden appearance and disappearance was also a feature of it. There's a story in Lucian's Lover of Lies where the person who was hosting this symposium where people talking about these, the fantastic stories, talks about his own wife coming back from the dead to get a slipper, a golden slipper that he had forgotten to burn, because the idea was you burned everybody's possessions with them, and that way the possessions follow them into the afterlife. And so he's saying that, she came back because this slipper had been knocked under the couch and they had not found it. And so they didn't burn her slipper, and she's missing one of them. And so she comes back from the dead, and she suddenly disappears when their little toy dog barks, and it startles her, and she, poof, she's gone. Now, obviously, Lucian is in The Lover of Lies, as the title suggests, is making fun of these beliefs. But there wouldn't be any point in writing that if people didn't know that ghosts could be startled and that ghosts were, for example, afraid of metal, they're afraid of iron, they're afraid of certain colors like red, and they could appear and disappear at will. And so in Luke's story of the road to Emmaus, where Jesus talks to these people on the road and explains all these prophecies about himself, but they don't recognize it. And then at dinner, he breaks bread, and suddenly their eyes are opened, and they go, oh, it's Jesus, and immediately, poof, he disappears. So this is common with ghosts. They appear, disappear pretty much at will. They're just there are quite a number of them. There's the famous story of Philinian, who is this young woman who dies before being married. That was a big no-no in the Greco-Roman world. Women were supposed to get married. They're supposed to have children. That's the purpose of women in that culture. The primary purpose is having babies. So if you died without being married and having a baby, you were missing something, and you became a restless ghost. So Philinian comes back, having never been married. She comes back to her parents' house after she's been buried for quite a long time. And she appears at night, and she has sex with this guy who is a guest in the house, a young man named Machates. Eventually, the maid kind of spots them through the door and tells the parents, and then the parents go the next morning to confront Philinian. And when they do finally confront her, she suddenly dies all over again. So they're very disturbed about this, obviously, because they are pretty sure they buried her. So the people of the city go and open the tomb, and her tomb is empty. But it has two things in it. It has a ring and a cup that Machates had given her on previous nights as tokens of affection. So we have an empty tomb, and we have little tokens left inside of it. And that matches up with the gospel account in Luke and Matthew, I believe also, where the disciples rush to the tomb and they find the wrappings, Jesus' grave wrappings, are left in the tomb. So it's the same basic pattern, an empty tomb with the tokens of the person who has disappeared. And you could go on, the eating and drinking as a proof of life, the touching. You have to prove that the person is really back from the dead. They have to be tangible. You have to be able to reach out, touch them, and that's also pretty common. So all of these features, like I said before, do not have to be consciously lifted from different ghost stories and incorporated into the Gospels, because they're already out there. They're like the features of like I said before, of the vampire story. If somebody asks you write a vampire story, you already know what all the features of vampire stories are. You might throw something in there, a little curveball, but basically it's a vampire story because it conforms to the whole genre of the vampire.
Next question. So in your article, you talk about the Revenant. Is that a restless ghost? And then you just mentioned like a sexual ghost. What other types of ghosts were described in different ancient writings?
Well, the Revenant comes from the French. It's a French, basically, present participle that means being back. So the Revenant, as we understand it today in terms of classification, ghost taxonomy, I guess, if you will, is that the revenant is a physically solid ghost. It's a ghost that's tangible, that can be touched, that it occupies space, might cast a shadow, etc. There's a story in Lucian, the Metamorphosis, actually, about this miller and a crone, and this old crone turns out to be a ghost. And in the course of the story, you discover that she's solid, and yet after she kills the miller in this locked room, of course, then she disappears. So it's kind of weird. It's like they're physical, but they don't obey the laws of physics. So Jesus in the Gospel of John appears a couple of times, even though the doors are locked. So obviously he didn't just walk in the door. He just appeared. And yet he's solid. And he performs activities of living people. He talks, he walks, he eats fish, so on and so on. And this is a typical kind of ghost in Greco-Roman stories, but he's not actually there on one level. It's contradictory and it's bizarre, which is typical of ghost stories generally. We have modern ghost stories of people who were seen by witnesses who appear to be solid, who appear to be engaging in activities of life, and then turn out to be dead. So it's not something for which there is an explanation in the Gospels or in the ghost stories from the Greco-Roman world of the time. And then, of course, you have apparitions. The more typical ghost was familiar with these people. They were ghosts that were seen, or they were sensed. They were heard. In the Lover of Lies are a couple of cases where a statue comes to life, but the only evidence of the statue being alive is that there's strange noises in the house that are then attributed to the statue having come to life and walking around. I think that Lucian was pointing out in this story indirectly that it wasn't something someone saw, it was something that was audible. They heard it and they attributed it or misattributed it to something that wasn't real. And I think that was well known in the ancient world, and it's well known today that people's imaginations run away with them. And obviously people in the ancient world understood that some people hallucinate, that some people have overactive imaginations, that some people are easily frightened, and they draw the wrong conclusions from their surroundings, and that they had that explanation for ghosts just as we do. But the point being that there were a wide selection of specters or apparitions, if you will. They could be seen in dreams. In fact, that was probably the most common way of seeing a ghost that's recorded in the ancient world, is that they were seen in dreams. But people in the ancient world had a tendency to think that those dreams were more meaningful than we do. So if we dream about somebody today that's dead, we'd say, well, that we just dreamt that. It's not there. But in the ancient world, people tended to take those much more seriously and consider them as real.
In your article, you mentioned the Jewish source, the Sefer HaRasim, which speaks of the ghost of the dead spending time in the tombs. How is that related to the first century Jews who followed Jesus and their views about his comeback or his apparitions?
The Sefer HaRasim, as I recall, was reconstructed by the original investigator from a bunch of fragments of material found in Cairo, in the Cairo Geniza, which was the storage room typically for scripture. The scripture that had the divine name in it was not was not destroyed when it was worn out. It was simply stored because you didn't want to destroy it. It had the divine name in it. The chirokinese apparently had a wealth of other material in it, some of which I can't remember the gentleman's name right now who originally reconstructed it. But he reconstructed it from fragments, put it all back together, and I think that the current understanding is that he missed some, and that there were some fragments in there that actually belonged in it that he didn't identify correctly, which is not surprising. But one way or the other, the Sefer HaRazim probably, although it comes from a time after Jesus, it probably reflects beliefs that were around for a very, very long time, probably maybe even centuries before Jesus. And the point about it is that it accepts the reality of ghosts, and that if you wanted to inquire of a ghost, you could go to a tomb and you could do certain things and say certain things, the ghost would appear and answer you. Which brings up an interesting point, because in the ancient world, it was believed that the spirit world knew things that were going to happen in the physical world. They knew that the spirit entities, whether they were demons or ghosts, know the truth about what's going on. And you see that in Mark, where Jesus casts out demons, and they identify him as the Christ, or as the Holy One, the Son of God, whatever. And Jesus rebukes them and tells them not to reveal it. So that's the same basic idea of necromancy. Necromancy literally means consulting the dead. A mantis in ancient Greek is actually a soothsayer, a fortune teller, as it were, who predicts the future. And it was understood widely that spirit entities, including ghosts, knew what the future was. How they know that, I'm not sure. I don't think anybody, as far as I know, wrote down an explanation for how they were supposed to know what they knew. But it was widely accepted that demons, ghosts, and the word demon, by the way, in Greek is very, very frequently used as a synonym for ghost. There are several other terms, phasma, and several others, eidolon, but daemon is very frequently used as a synonym for ghost. So basically, what we're talking about, without us imposing a category of demons being evil spirits and ghosts being the spirits of dead people, the ancient people may not have distinguished between them quite that closely or narrowly. But the long story short is that basically the spirit world knew what was going on really, and if you wanted to find out what was going on really, you had to consult one, a ghost, a demon, or whatever. You had to call up a spirit entity of some kind, and then they would tell you what was actually happening or what the future would be.
Tell us more about the different characters who were shapeshifters in Roman myth and how it relates to the apocryphal works that speak of Jesus and his disciples.
Well, the term shape-shifting in our culture is typically associated with werewolves and what have you, but in the case of the ancient accounts, it was called polymorphy or polymorphism, morphe being the Greek word for form and poly being many. So a number of especially chthonic or dark deities like Hecate, for example, could assume various forms. They could assume the forms of animals. They could assume the form of people. They could be large in size. They could change pretty much at will. In the Gospel of Mark, there is an ending which is widely regarded as being a spurious ending that was added later, where where the text says that Jesus appeared to someone in a different form. The apologist Origen, who was writing in the 2nd century, suggested actually that Jesus was polymorphic even in life, that he appeared differently to different people, depending on their intent. But in the apocryphal Acts and the apocryphal Gospels that come along in the 2nd, 3rd century, Jesus appears as all kinds of people. He appears as the Apostle Thomas. He appears as a child. He appears as a young boy. He appears in all kinds of different guises to people. It's interesting that in the Gospels in Luke, when he is talking to these disciples on the road to Emmaus, that they don't recognize him. When the disciples, John, I think it is, go to, maybe, I'm not sure whether it's John or Matthew right now, I'd have to look it up, but they go to Galilee and they're fishing, and Jesus tells them, cast the net in on the other side of the boat, and they haul out this huge haul of fish, and then suddenly they recognize that it's Jesus. But they didn't recognize him previously, so supposedly they recognize him due to the miracle of the large number of fish. So it would imply, certainly without specifically saying it, that Jesus looked different on different occasions after his resurrection. And that would be typical of other entities such as Hecate, which I mentioned, and other gods, goddesses who change form more or less at will. And again, I'm not saying or claiming that the gospel writers deliberately plagiarized that from an account somewhere. It was just simply a given. It was the general understanding among people that this is what happened to supernatural entities, that if Jesus is a god, he's raised from the dead, he can transform, he can appear however he wants. This is simply part of the culture's currency. It's a general understanding. It's in the same way that, like, I keep going back to this reference because it seems to fit culturally, that people know all these things about vampires even without maybe having ever read Dracula, for example. They've never read the novel. They may have seen the film adaptation of it, but they have learned through exposure to the general culture what vampires are all about. And so people in the ancient world did not even have to be literate. They didn't have to read all these things. They simply knew from their parents. They knew from just hearing people talk, from hearing stories told about how things were, how ghosts were, how gods were, how they worked, how they appeared or disappeared.
Tell us about the figures of Romulus and Apollonius, in the similarities between Jesus and them. I always see the similarities between, like, Socrates or other leaders or philosophers around that time, sacrificing his life and things like that. But from your article, there's like clear influence or connection between those two other figures, Romulus and Apollonius.
Well, I use that description of the death and reappearance of Romulus that is taken from Plutarch as just an example of how a historic figure is treated in these so-called histories. Obviously, nobody believes that this was a real history in the sense that we use it. But it was passed off as history that Romulus disappeared under suspicious circumstances